It started with a flop.
They released it to test audiences, and people hated it. They had a bomb on their hands.
But a young visionary turned failure into success.
Shigeru Miyamoto got a job at Nintendo and was told, save this thing, it's horrible, make it better. And Miyamoto did exactly that.
And created a legendary character.
I remember my friends coming home from the arcade telling me about this new game called Donkī Kong, and that I had to go check it out.
I was so blown away by just how quickly I wanted to sit for hours and hours and just play.
His rise stirred up some controversy.
They got sued by the movie studio for violating the copyright on King Kong.
He was almost forgotten by the gaming world.
There was this 10-year gap between the last Donkey Kong game and then Donkey Kong Country.
But he became a pillar of gaming history.
Donkey Kong definitely deserves a place in the pantheon of character gods.
This is the tale of the one and only Donkey Kong. In 1980, arcade games such as Pac-Man and Tempest are king. And everyone is gaming.
They popped up everywhere. 7-Elevens would carry them. By the time we get to the middle 80s, grocery stores are carrying them. The funny one, of course, is that at least one funeral home had a couple of arcade machines in its basement. It was an incredible phenomenon at that time.
It wasn't like a kid phenomenon. It was really across-the-board phenomenon in terms of who was playing arcade games.
That same year, a Japanese trading card company called Nintendo decides to get in on the action.
Nintendo wanted a piece of that pie. And so they developed a game called Radar Scope, an arcade game.
But the game turns into an explosive disaster.
They released it to test audiences, and people hated it. Radar Scope was just not good. They had a bomb on their hands.
This failure creates a new opportunity for a young artist.
This man named Miyamoto called in a favor with Yamauchi, the boss at Nintendo at that time, and said, don't you want to give my son a job? He's an artist. He can design cool little characters and work on new arcade games.
And his name is Shigeru Miyamoto.
There were actually about 3 or 4 designers before me, but I was the first person to enter Nintendo as an industrial designer.
Shigeru Miyamoto got a job at Nintendo and was immediately put to use on Radar Scope and told, save this thing, it's horrible, make it better. And Miyamoto did exactly that. He saved it by saying, it's so bad, we can't even use it, toss it out. We're going to use the same technology to create something new.
From the ashes of Nintendo's first failure comes an entirely new game.
The idea came up to take a really popular cartoon character and make a game for it. The Japanese thought it was a good idea to take Popeye, who can punch people and always has to save olive oil, the damsel in distress.
We began development on that game originally with the idea of using Popeye in it.
And it seemed like a really good idea for a video game, but it wasn't meant to be.
When Nintendo can't secure rights to use Popeye because of legal issues, Miyamoto creates a game in which players must rescue a girl from an oversized ape. He calls the game Donkey Kong.
Here comes this game with this anti-hero pursuing a giant monkey, well, technically ape, climbing up a skyscraper, and it had this horrible title, Donkī Kong.
The opening cinematic, for the time, has Donkey Kong grabbing the girl and starting to climb the ladder, and then he knocks the girders down and creates the environment which you were about to play in. So it set the stage, told you the story, however simple it might have been, was that this King Kong ape has stolen this attractive female and you're the hero who's coming to her rescue. It's set the stage for many video games to come.
The whole story behind the title, I think, is an interesting one because I think it was Miyamoto. Miyamoto wanted to find a good name for his Kong title that wasn't King Kong. And so he looked in the dictionary for the word stubborn. And of course, in the dictionary, it said stuff like stubborn like a mule, stubborn like a donkey, and boom. For some odd reason, he latched onto the whole donkey thing and called it Donkī Kong.
Miyamoto's new game is ready to ship, but will it face the same fate as Radar Scope?
The US distributors weren't so happy with the title, with the look of the game. They thought it was too childish, you know? At the time, the games in the arcades were Space Invaders, shoot 'em ups. You had games like Missile Command, you know? It was always about saving the world from the alien invaders or evil Russians or whoever.
I think early on there were a lot of arcade games out there, some of which weren't successful. People were questioning how successful was the video game industry going to be. And here was this new arcade, and nobody was quite sure what to make of it.
Wait a second, Donkey Kong? You know, if you think about it, it's pretty ridiculous. So imagine the way the US distributors must have felt when here comes this team of Japanese video game makers, a toy maker, and says, got this great game called Donkey Kong. And they're like, bomb. Space Invaders, that's the title, Missile Command, you know, save the world. So they weren't too enthusiastic about it. Nobody thought this thing would take off.
It's June of 1981, and Nintendo's new game slowly makes its way to arcades in the US. It doesn't take long for the new game to turn heads.
I remember my friends coming home from the arcade telling me about this new game called Donkey Kong, and that I had to go check it out. So, the next weekend I was down at the arcade.
The first time I saw Donkey Kong was in the arcade. I think it was a tabletop the first time I saw it, and I was so blown away by just how quickly I wanted to like sit for hours and hours and just play. Get over the barrels and get to the top, and I must have played that game for 30 hours.
It was a brand new gaming experience, being able to climb ladders, being able to jump, how the control you had over the sky. It was totally something new, and I was hooked instantly.
Donkey Kong becomes an instant sensation. More than 65,000 Donkey Kong arcade units are shipped to the US in its first year.
Once the arcade game got out there and we started to see the reaction of gamers, we knew we had a hit on our hands.
Donkey Kong, just like, whether it was because it was an early game, one of the first games that I saw, or whether it was just because there was some, magic in there, it was Miyamoto's first game, right? It just nailed it. It just did everything perfectly. Every bit of that game was tuned perfectly. The graphics and the gameplay went together perfectly. It had just the right level of concreteness and abstractness and weirdness to kind of hook you, and the music's fantastic.
What was fun about it was the pure simplicity of the game. There wasn't a whole lot that you had to do, but when you got down to it, it was fairly sophisticated in terms of the timing. You had to get your jumps just right, you had to move up the ladders at just the right time, and there were patterns that you could eventually learn to win.
With its massive success, it doesn't take Hollywood long to notice Donkey Kong. But the kind of attention the game gets isn't what Nintendo is expecting.
You had Donkey Kong, and loosely it was based on the King Kong story, of course. Big ape takes the blonde girl, climbs up a skyscraper, and somebody has to rescue her. Of course, Nintendo said, no, this is not based on King Kong at all, because Universal owned the license, or at least it was perceived that they owned the license at the time.
They got sued by the movie studio for violating the copyright on King Kong.
Sure enough, after the creation of Donkey Kong, Universal actually sued Nintendo and said, you're infringing on our rights of this old movie property.
But the courts ruled that Nintendo had not infringed on Universal's rights with Donkey Kong. Not only that, Universal is ordered to pay the Japanese game company $1.6 million to cover lawyer fees and punitive damages. Ironically, at the same time, a number of Donkey Kong knockoffs begin to appear.
Donkey Kong was so successful that within no time you had all these clones that popped up. I think the most infamous one is Crazy Kong, which not only shares the Kong title, but it's the exact same game, Instead of climbing up and going rah, 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 or jumping around, he just growls. There's subtle differences. If you didn't know, you'd probably not notice it. But imitation is the biggest form of flattery. And the moment these video game companies saw this huge success, Donkey Kong, they wanted to duplicate it.
And the next version of the game hits in late 1982. This time, Donkey Kong becomes a more sympathetic character.
Donkey Kong Jr. was kind of cool because you saw the story from another angle. Instead of having the bad monkey steal the girl, you had the roles reversed. You had Mario kind of in a more negative role.
It brought back the same familiar characters, and it was cool to see them in a different context. It was interesting to see how well sequels can really tap into your psyche if you have fallen in love with a particular game. As soon as you see those characters again, you've got to play the game. And for Donkey Kong Jr., that really was cool. What was interesting about Donkey Kong Jr. as well is that it introduced the new characters. And that was one of the first times that I'd seen that in games.
Donkey Kong has gone from being a small-time chimp to the king of the arcades. But how much longer will Nintendo's unique franchise be able to continue its reign? By 1983, after 2 successful arcade games, Donkey Kong is a true phenomenon. Soon, a 3rd Donkey Kong game appears, where once again Kong is shown as a villain. But the game isn't as well received as the previous titles.
I did play Donkey Kong 3 in the bug house, and you had to spray bug spray up Donkey Kong's ass. It was sort of a fringe Donkey Kong game. I don't know if it was from the very beginning destined to be a Donkey Kong game, or if it started out as something else you're trying to push to the top of the bug house, and they just put Donkey Kong in there to make it attractive.
The once mighty Kong begins to fall. A few more titles are released, such as Donkey Kong Jr. Math for the Famicom in 1983, but interest in the series is waning.
I think the reason that Donkey Kong kind of disappeared was because Mario was the interesting character. Mario was the guy you were playing. As a player, that's who you identify with. Donkey Kong himself, if that's who Donkey Kong really is, the big ape, was kind of a side note.
Mario became their bankable hero, and they really were focusing on the Mario franchise for so long that I think Donkey Kong just took a back seat for a while.
But in 1994, 13 years after it first debuted, the Donkey Kong series makes a comeback, thanks to a development house in the UK called Rare.
In 1993, Rare Limited, an English company that was a partner of Nintendo's, got permission to use Donkey Kong, a character that Miyamoto had created, to make a game called Donkey Kong Country. Which had this very 3D rendered look to it. It was the first game on the Super NES to have that look. It looked great.
I think it was the first time that any of us had seen 3D rendered characters used as sprites in a game. It really stood out from the rest of the games being produced for that generation just because it was so slick graphically.
Donkey Kong Country is a really good use of the Super Nintendo's abilities as a gaming machine to take some pre-rendered graphics and make the environment look pseudo 3D.
The animations were great, the characters looked like they possessed depth, the gameplay was addictive. It was a platformer in the true sense of the word. It established firmly the minecart level as something that all future platformers had to have.
You know, I don't know why there was this 10-year gap between like the last Donkey Kong game and then Donkey Kong Country. You know, it's almost like Donkey Kong's like the Chewbacca of the Nintendo world, you know? Like Star Wars, everybody gets a medal but Chewbacca, and it's like in the Nintendo world, like Donkey Kong's always kind of been pushed to the side in favor of Mario and Luigi and stuff, and it's a bummer.
Well, Donkey Kong Country was a huge success.
Donkey Kong Country sells more than 8 million copies, setting a record for the best-selling 16-bit game of all time. And once again, Donkey Kong is the good guy. But despite the title's commercial success, some people are critical.
It's the epitome of bad game design. You're asked to collect all these different things that really don't do anything for the player. 5,000 bananas, yay, what does it get me? Nothing. It's just to keep you occupied, make you walk through the same levels again.
I did an interview where I had Tim Stamper, the creator of Donkey Kong Country, and Shigeru Miyamoto at the same time. And Miyamoto was ruthless. Miyamoto said things like, Donkey Kong Country proves that Americans will buy a game with mediocre gameplay as long as the graphics are excellent.
It was boring, yet the game garnered reviews in the 9s everywhere and people bought it. It's baffling.
And Stamper, you know, just the quintessential English gentleman, sat there and took it. And even though really the anger wasn't meant to be at Stamper, practice. Miyamoto carved his territory. He marked his area. He was letting people know that he was the greatest.
Despite the opinion some critics have of the game,
Some of the most overrated games are in the Donkey Kong Country franchise.
Rare goes on to turn Donkey Kong Country into a franchise, releasing Donkey Kong Country 2: Diddy Kong's Quest in 1995. Donkey Kong Country 3: Dixie Kong's Double Trouble is released in 1996. Soon, Donkey Kong will take his first step into a whole new dimension. In 1996, Donkey Kong and his extended family are in the middle of a revival, thanks to games like Donkey Kong Country for the Super Nintendo. But it's not until 3 years later that a full 3D Kong game is released. Nintendo spares no expense to hype up the release of Donkey Kong 64. And the game becomes a financial success, selling 1.9 million copies. But the response from critics is mixed.
I remember that Donkey Kong 64 was fairly frustrating.
I really enjoyed that game. I just thought it was great.
I was a little bit disappointed.
Normally, it's not too cool to harsh on other people's games in this industry, but man, there were too many collectibles in that game.
I was really put off by the amount of collecting of bananas that I had to do and how I had to switch characters just in order to collect a certain color banana.
I had trouble keeping track of what I was supposed to be doing at any time.
It was a game that I did finish, but as a game developer, I felt I should complete the game, but not as a gamer, a game that I really wanted to play to the end.
It was Donkey Kong 64 where I actually stayed in that world for quite some time. It was really neat how it just opened right up and it was very vast. And it was like building on these characters that you had this history with for years and years.
I think it was a noble attempt to bring it into the Donkey Kong Country franchise into 3D. They had created a strong cast of characters that were expanding on the Nintendo 64.
I want you to do everything in your power to keep Donkey Kong distracted. Steal that all the golden bananas he treasured so much.
I just think that, there's high points and middle points and low points in games, and this was somewhere in that range. I don't think they were just trying to cash in and make a mediocre game sell because of a strong license.
I hope for your sake, you're right.
I think it was a real attempt at making a hit game.
I think it was a technological achievement. Developing free-roaming 3D platformer was difficult, and they did a good job of it. But the choices that players had were overwhelming.
Today, more than 15 million Donkey Kong games have been sold for handheld gaming systems, while over 28 million have been sold for consoles.
It's a character that has everything that's needed to be huge. He's very identifiable. He has a personality. He's silent, but he still has that strong personality. He's funny. And I think that Donkey Kong certainly has a chance of being as big in the future as he was in the past.
In 2004, a collection of new Donkey Kong titles are announced, including Donkey Kong Jungle Beat and Donkey Konga. While Donkey Kong has had his share of failures and success, there is no denying his place in gaming history.
All games these days are really standing on the shoulders of giants. Games like Donkey Kong. We take our lessons from all of those games that were kind of hammered home when we were kids. You see the same types of gameplay appearing over and over again in today's best games.
Donkey Kong definitely deserves a place in the pantheon of character gods. Donkey Kong is one of my favorites. A lot of people remember him fondly and still hope that he comes out with yet another game and he relaunches himself into preeminence. And I don't really think there's any fundamental reason why he can't.
Well, Donkey Kong, they play up that he's the strongest of the group, likes to have a good time. They put the necktie on him to show that he's got a little bit of personality to him. Very lovable character.
The thing about Donkey Kong that makes him a great character is he's got like the zen of Kong, right? He's this kind of complicated character. Is he a friend? Is he an enemy? And you know, they've done some things with him over time, but I don't think they've ever really like completely explored the character to like really know what makes Donkey Kong tick.
To me, Donkey Kong holds a very precious place for me because that was really the first time where I was recognized for my work in game design. I mean, up to that point, video games had been designed mostly by technical people, and it was really the first time that a designer had actually created a game and been recognized for that work.
It all started with Easter eggs. Before you know it, I couldn't get enough of God mode.
When I don't punch him in, I get a little weak.
I thought you were supposed to go backwards in Pitfall. I can't even make it through 2 levels without infinite ammo.
I can't remember a time when I didn't use codes.
They made up the codes, I just used them.
No one's gonna find out.
Get the latest cheat codes and walk-through strategies for Grand Theft Auto San Andreas.
Write the homie to see if you got what it takes.
Cheat season premiere, January 18th.